All right. Hi, Jim. I can see you there. Good morning to you. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to the 70th edition of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Today, we have also a special guest, Mr. Lee, the Trading Director for Vietnat in Vietnam. But before I go over to Jim, let me say that the ACA conference is approaching, and from the 17th to 19th, we have the learning sessions, and then the 20th will be for the visit to the GDIZ Arise in industrial zone in the Glojigbe area of Benin, and also to have the main conference within Cotonou itself. Let me also say that we are having this session in both English and French. So please use the buttons at the bottom to select the right language of your choice. Hi, Jim. It's been a long while since we last had you, and many things have happened in the industry. And at this point, I want to find out from you, what do you have for us this week?
Good morning, Ernest. Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
It's been quite a season so far, hasn't it? So
Yeah.
what I thought we'd do today was to take a look at what's happened in 2024, a kind of a mid-year review.
Yeah.
So of the year, and I'm just going to give
Now
me a
your,
moment.
now your volume is better. Now your volume is better, Jim. We almost lost you at some point, but please go ahead and I'll leave you to the audience.
All right. Well, I've just
Very
changed my microphone, which explains the
Very
situation.
good. You are loud and clear now. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Ernest. So what we're talking about today is we're talking about what's happened in this very eventful, very unpredictable, very strange year of 2024. We're just over halfway through, so I thought let's do a mid-year review, so to speak. We'll have a look at what's happened in production, what's happened in the raw cashew nut trade. We'll have a look at cashew kernels demand and the patterns of trade. We'll have a look at prices, and last we'll have a look at policy and regulation, because that has been a real factor in 2024 across a whole range of countries. That's not something that we might have said about the cashew sector 5-7 years ago. Big factor nowadays. But let's start just by reflecting on what's different about the second part of the year. What's different about the second half of the year, or more critically, August, December? And these are the factors that I would look at. First of all, 87% of the crop is harvested in that period, January to July, the period just ending today. Only 13% in August, December. Those are the Southern Hemisphere crops. Those are the crops in Brazil, Mozambique, Tanzania, Indonesia. During this period, there's higher consumption almost everywhere. Festivals have a big part to play. We have the Autumn Festival in China. We have Diwali in India, one of the biggest consumption periods. Thanksgiving in North America, and of course Christmas in a number of places right at the end of the year. So buyers may well be active in July and August for those festivals before the festival demand peters out. And then often we see during that period, October, early November, we can then really get a good idea of how demand was for the year, because depending on the market, most buying is done well in advance of the festival. So international buying, so we're talking about markets in Europe, in the Middle East, in North America, most of the international buying is done before June, and the actual physical imports peak mid-year. So it's rare that you get a spike in demand in Europe, for example, because of end-of-year festivals. In fact, in markets that buy forward, buyers will start to focus not on Festival 2024, but on 2025. If they haven't already done so, they'll start to buy for 2025 and they'll decide how much cover, how the prices look, and what their predictions are for demand into next year. It's in this period between August and December that the shortages or the surpluses, or indeed the overreaction or underreaction to those fundamentals, tend to be resolved, and the demand trends tend to show. So the second part of the year in cashews, which we're talking about August to December, during those southern hemisphere crops, that's the period when most of the questions are resolved and answered. Will we see that this year? Well, it's not entirely sure, but let's have a look at some of the factors that are influencing that and some of the things that have happened this year so far. We're going to start with production. So I'll give you a quick review across a whole range of countries, major producers of cashews, and we'll start in Asia, and we'll start with the biggest grower of cashews in Asia, Cambodia. And there we've seen some changes this year. Initially, the estimate for the Cambodian crop was around about 1 million tons. That may never have been likely, but it did sink very quickly where people started to talk about a much smaller crop, as low as 700,000 tons at one stage. But as often happens, especially in cashews, but in a lot of products, the estimates got bigger as the season went on. So the current estimate for the Cambodian crop is 850,000 tons. That hasn't changed since our last session early in July. And it would mean that it is the second largest crop in history. And what's happened is that there were some areas affected by poor weather, but the additional hectares that came online tended to compensate for that. So far, Vietnam reports imports of about 796,000 tons, almost 800,000 tons. Figures differ between agencies in Vietnam. The range is 780 to 796. Either way, it's a lot of cashews. It's almost 800,000 tons. Interestingly, the figures in Cambodia report only 745,000 tons exported, and so at some point that needs to be reconciled. During the second half of the year, July to December, in the last 2 years, Cambodia exported around about 50,000 tons. So it wouldn't be surprising if that figure grew a little bit and we saw another 50,000 tons trickle back into the markets in Vietnam in the second half of the year. Interestingly, in Cambodia, plantings officially reported now at 580,000 hectares, which fits well with the average yield and this year's crop. But there are dissenting voices to that. There are some studies that estimate the planted area much lower, which doesn't change the crop, but it means that the yield on those hectares is much higher. Interesting in Cambodia, but definitely another successful year for the Cambodian cashew sector. We go to India, the second largest producer in Asia, and that's a different story. So the Indian crop is now finished, or just about finished. The crop is in, and it's certainly lower. There's no official numbers, so I did a survey of opinions of people whose opinion I'd respect, but I got quite a range of estimates. So I got people talking about 20% down. Now, everyone was down. Everyone thought that the crop was smaller than last year and smaller than the expectations. But I got a wide range from 20% down to, in one case, 50% down. But it seemed to be influenced by where the reporter is located. So it looks like the impact on the eastern states is much greater than in the western states. Putting it all together, I'm looking at an estimate somewhere between 600,000 and 625,000 tons. That's not a statistical number. That's a survey of opinions. It's worked in the past. I think this is probably about right. That'd mean it's the worst crop for 10 years in India. So we are looking at significantly lower production, and you would wonder why are Indian buyers not more active in the raw cashew nut market if their crop is so low. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. In Vietnam, the third largest producer in Asia, and of course the largest importer, the largest processor and exporter of kernels, we see a lower crop than last year. Again, the area planted to cashews in Vietnam is slowly dropping. Now, there are efforts to reverse that, but it is slowly dropping in favor of other crops. Estimates now are about 300,000 hectares of productive cashew trees. Estimated crop this year, around about 300,000 tons. If someone says it's 320 or 315, I wouldn't argue with them, but it's less than last year. And the focus now in Vietnam appears to more and more be on Cambodia and Laos as potential areas for expansion of regional growing to supply the Vietnamese processing industry. It's interesting in Vietnam that whatever way we look at it, whether it's 315 or 300, that there's only somewhere between 10 and 12% of the processing capacity of Vietnam grown within the country. And that is a key factor that determines the way the cashew industry works worldwide. The fact that it's processed in Vietnam and re-exported is also a huge influence. Different to India, where yes, the imports are huge, 1.1 million tons last year, but primarily consumed within India. So let's move on and let's have a look at the largest producing region in the world. Somewhere between 48 and 49% of cashews grown in the world will be grown in West Africa this year. We have a quick run around the country, starting with Nigeria. Actually looks like quite a good crop in Nigeria according to reports. Thanks to African Cashew Alliance reporters. African Cashew Alliance Splits is a pretty good publication that's out every 2 weeks, give you an update on the African cashew market. Estimates in Nigeria between 300 and 350,000 tons. Key factors. This will include some product coming in from Benin. Processors this year are reported to have sourced 60,000 tons, which is an increase in processing. In Ghana, the Ghanaian crop is always a little bit difficult to estimate. Ghana is a transit through point for raw cashews from landlocked countries to the north, but also product coming in from Cote d'Ivoire. So we think this year in volume terms it was quite a decent crop, but much lower quality. So we're putting in a crop estimate of about 150,000 tons. Earlier estimates and official estimates were more like 200,000 tons, but frankly, I'm not buying that. I think 150 is about right. Benin, again, complex case. Actors are estimating a crop of between 140 and 160,000 tons. Why is it difficult to estimate the crop? Well, because so much of it, in fact, the bulk of it, is heading in cross-border trade into Togo or into Nigeria due to the export ban. So exports of raw cashew nuts are still not permitted in Benin. And the government, for now at least, seems to accept that illegal trade is inevitable. There were one or two clampdowns, but you clamp down on export, cross-border export at the end of the season, really it's a gesture. And it's a very difficult thing to control, and it's a very difficult policy to implement. So the season is over, processing is up. They tell me that processors have sourced about 45,000 tons. That's way below their capacity. This year, capacity allowing for a certain scaling up. Capacity could be over 100,000 tons, but it'll be way underutilized. And probably will continue to be that way until this situation on exports is resolved. Cote d'Ivoire, the crop is in. I don't think there's much left on farms, but there is quite a bit of product left with local traders. That ban on or more correctly, suspension of raw cashew nut exports is still in place. Incredibly, it's still in place 50 days after the initial loosening of the ban on stocks and warehouses. We expected that that would happen much more quickly. I think the CCA would like to lift the ban, but I think they're waiting for permission in a rather turbulent situation there, as you probably have heard. They're waiting for permission to lift that ban. Crop estimates still about 1.1 million tonnes. That's well down on 2023, but it would be a better crop than 2022. So this brings us to an important point. The comparison with 2023 may well give us the impression that crops this year are poor. But if we bear in mind that 2023 was in fact a bumper crop in many countries, it gives us a much more realistic look at it. One thing though is certain, and that is that the quality throughout many West African countries this year, due to the weather conditions, is poorer than in previous years. Now in Côte d'Ivoire, that's complicated by the interruption in the export of raw cashew nuts, where again, without an adequate infrastructure to store the product, with rain during the season, and with generally poor support for that post-harvest segment of the industry, quality will decline in the course of the season. It's bad news for processors in Côte d'Ivoire who are struggling with lower quality material. So normally they might be expecting a 46, 47 pound, and this year they might be looking at 43, 44, and a lot of the product is lower than that. A factor that we shouldn't discount, and which I've mentioned already, is this cross-border trade. The arrows are red because, strictly speaking, this trade is illegal. It's illegal to export from Côte d'Ivoire by road. It's illegal to export from Benin, to export RCN from Benin. But this goes on, and in a certain way, it's acted as a safety valve in both countries for farmers in terms of supporting price and for traders in terms of supporting cash flow. But it is highly impactful. Overall, in this area, the overall reduction in the quantity harvested is nowhere near the rumours or the stories that were floated earlier in the year. Talk of disastrous crops, talks of huge fall in production turned out not to be accurate. And you do wonder at this point, were they in fact designed simply to manipulate prices? Anyway, they had an effect. It wasn't constructive, and they also had an effect on policy. And I would say that the suspension of exports in Côte d'Ivoire was partially a consequence of that. Let's look elsewhere in West Africa. In Burkina, and it did seem that the further north you went in West Africa, that the impact of the weather conditions on the crop was worse. Further north in any individual country, or into Burkina or into Mali. So the estimates of the crop is down, raw cashew nut supply is limited. In Guinea-Bissau, looks like the crop is in, probably not that much left on farms, there may be some. You can track farm gate prices and local warehouse prices as an indicator of that. Estimates, and we don't really know the truth of this yet, but general estimates around about 10% lower, which would make the crop a little bit lower than the 2022 crop. Significantly lower than 2023, but there have been changes in the way the crop is marketed this year, which make it a little bit difficult to track exactly what's happened. And those changes involve Senegal. So if we look in Senegal, what we see, first of all, is that exports from Senegal this year will be much, much lower than last year. And that's mainly because material from Guinea-Bissau is not flowing across the border into Senegal in the way it did this year. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to our last section on policy and regulation. In Senegal, we're looking at a crop around about 40,000 tonnes, I think. Most of that is sold or moved. Processing in Senegal is very limited. There are moves now amongst some stakeholders in the industry to stimulate processing. It is a high quality raw material, and it'll be interesting to see. We do expect in the coming years that production in Senegal will increase. In the Gambia, looks like a good crop. We don't know what's actually grown in the Gambia and what's coming through from Senegal, but about 20,000 tons has gone through. That's way lower than it was 10 years ago. At one time, going through the Gambia was almost 100,000 tons, which was product from Senegal, product from Guinea-Bissau, product from Mali flowing through the port of Banjul. That's cut back now, and about 20,000 tons has gone through the port. Small producer, very good quality, much in demand, probably all sold at this stage. Guinea, crop lower, 10 to 15%. Now again, you have the situation in Guinea where the statistics on production are very unclear. You'll see estimates from 60,000 to 200,000. I track them by trade, and I'm on the way down on the lower end of that. The border trade again plays a part. There's border trade from Guinea-Bissau, and then there's more natural border trade from Mali for evacuation, but also some product comes in from Côte d'Ivoire into areas here. It's not been a great year for processing in Guinea. Processors have closed down. They've struggled with high prices. They've struggled with sources of supply. Hopefully that's a situation that will reverse from next year. So trying to bring that into some kind of overall picture, we're looking at these crop estimates. Now, the way I do it is I have a low estimate and I have a high estimate. The high estimate is about 4% below 2023, which would mean, at least in volume terms, it's a pretty good crop. The low estimate would be about 12% below 2023, a much lower crop. So there are differences between the high and the low. What are they? Well, at the moment, I've plugged in 600,000 tons for India, maybe on the low side, and 650,000 tons on the high side. There still is a discussion about Côte d'Ivoire. We'll see only by the end of the year, but there is a difference of about 100,000 tons between estimates. Nigeria, again, about 50,000 tons, and then a lot of small differences in a whole range of West African countries. So if we look at this, the difference between the high and the low is about 360,000 tons. Half of that is made up in these three countries listed: India, Côte d'Ivoire, and Nigeria. I suppose the other big feature we should mention is that Cambodia has grown in its share of production this year. This year, Cambodia will be 18% of world production, leaving it in second place. So looking at the estimates, the midpoint between the two is about the 2022 crop, and that may be where we end up when the dust settles and the statistics are collected. During the season, and I think this is the key factor to mention again, estimates went from, in the beginning, a good crop with question marks over the weather. It became, especially in West Africa, predictions became, it's okay, but it's late. Then it went to a very poor crop at different times, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, but that proved not to be the case. And the final judgment would be that the crop today might be described as better than expected, pretty much everywhere, except perhaps in India. So at least in terms of volume, the crop is not as bad as might have been expected. Now, across West Africa, if we take a general figure, we're looking at about 10% down. That is complicated by the fact that most countries have experienced lower quality. Côte d'Ivoire certainly has, Ghana certainly has, and of course lower quality raw cashew means lower yield. Lower yield means fewer cashew kernels. So 10% down in RCN this year probably translates into something like 12, 13% down overall in terms of kernels availability. If we look at the shares of production, looks like this year West Africa is between 48, 49% total share. East Africa, based on end of 2023, around about 8%. India's 13%, falling. Vietnam and Cambodia, about 1/4 of the world's cashews grow in those two countries. Of that, 18% is Cambodia and 7% is Vietnam. So again, to underline, the big feature is that most of the world's cashews grow in areas where they are not processed. Let's have a look at how this production year, this unusual production year, has translated into the raw cashew nut trade. And we will start in Vietnam. Vietnam is the biggest importer of raw cashew nuts and, of course, the biggest exporter of kernels. So we looked at Vietnam's imports from January until the 15th of July, and we compared 2022, 2023, and 2024. And the numbers are very healthy. 1.64 million tons imported, almost 8.5% up on 2023 by the 15th of July. This is despite any bans, interruptions, late crops, and so on. So how did that come about? Let's have a look at the monthly imports. So you have month-by-month imports for 3 years, 2022 in the light blue, 2023 in the dark, and in the red 2024. So if you look at 2024, what you see is a relatively slow start and then firing ahead. And this is the impact of Cambodia, of course. March, April, fades away a little bit in May and June. And this is where you may start to see the impact of the late crop in West Africa. But up to the first half of July, and during those first 2 weeks in July, 152,000 tons were imported, which is pretty much the same figure as this time last year. So let's have a look at just a time series across this. So I've added here the moving average for 2 months. It's a tight period, so we just take 2 months for 2022 and 2023. Now what we're seeing is that in 2022, a difficult year from a crop perspective, imports peaked early and then faded away as the year goes on. Last year, they were much later. So they peaked June, July, August was a big month too. And then they faded away as you would expect. So looking at this situation, looking at the red bars, we see high early imports, and that means we're not really seeing the impact of the export suspension from Côte d'Ivoire just yet. This may kick in, and you would expect to see it kick in the second half of July. What's also been noticeable is that earlier in the season, we saw a lot of, maybe panic isn't too strong a word to use, but we saw a lot of reaction and fears of late shipments, bans, hyping up the price. But then as physical arrivals started to come in May and June, we saw that the physical arrivals had much more impact than the expectations on shipment or fears of delays or fears of a lower crop. And that's just an indicator of just how cash flow driven the cashew sector is. So we could say, well, maybe we actually should put it more correctly and say it's driven by inadequate cash flow and the access to finance in the cashew sector. In a sector in Vietnam that's been struggling, in a sector in West Africa that's for many years struggled for working capital requirements, that the biggest impact on these delays in shipments is on the cash flow, and that's critical. And that can have a very long impact on the sector as a whole. So let's just have a quick look then at imports from Cambodia, and you can see, so the gray is 2024, and you can see 2024 month-to-month imports in the early part, March, April, way above last year and the year before. little bit of a slow start. The crop in Cambodia was perhaps a little bit later than expected, but once it got going, big imports. May matched previous years, and then it starts to fade away. So in this period, July through to December, in each of the last 2 years, Cambodia exported around about 50,000 tons. So what's happened is that more cashew nuts have come to Vietnam from Cambodia. They've come earlier because of location, and they're high quality. So that has changed a couple of things. On the one hand, it's changed the available raw material, and some of that raw material may be better suited for the Chinese market than for Western markets, for example. But it's also because you're buying higher priced, more product earlier, it places greater cash flow strains on the industry. So for now, at least, Cambodia has filled the gap left by later African crops. And until now, it's also filled the gap left by the shorter and the disrupted shipments from West Africa. So let's look at some of the countries that have been supplying Vietnam. And again, the comparison over the 3 years. And you can see that, let's look at some of the numbers. So Cambodia's, compared to 2023, an additional 210,000 tons. Tanzania down, Cote d'Ivoire down, but only by 43,000 tons out of 200,000. Ghana slightly up, and Nigeria slightly up. So if we look at this situation overall, what we're seeing is that shipments into Vietnam were down by about 40,000 tons over the period, certainly from the main origins supplying Vietnam. Shipments net, adding the pluses and the minuses together, were down by about 40,000 tons, but Cambodian shipments were up by about 210,000 tons. So this is partially the reason that raw cashew nut prices have stalled, despite the ban and suspension of shipments from Cote d'Ivoire. So let's look at those shipments from Cote d'Ivoire and let's see if we can gain any clues as to what's happened. So again, the 3 years, 2022 in blue, 2023 in orange, and grey is 2024. The trend line is for 2023, and you can see that the trend line tends to peak a little bit later. So this is a 2-month moving average indicating the peak import to Vietnam from Cote d'Ivoire during July, August. That won't happen this year. So when we look at it, we see initially much lower imports from Cote d'Ivoire, and that's the impact of the late crop. Then we see the export suspension coming in the first 10 days of May. Now, what that means, this comes in May, but obviously there's a time lag in shipments. So that's going to impact arrivals in July and arrivals in August. So if the ban had been lifted in June, when it was expected, this impact would have been somewhat alleviated. But because it's lifted rather late, this impact is still to come, but we haven't seen it yet in the import figures in Vietnam. It's in the perception, it's in the belief,
Les
but it's not
données
in the numbers.
des importations du Vietnam ne reflètent pas encore cela. C'est trop tôt pour les voir.
Overall, we're seeing the suspension of shipments from the second largest supplier mitigated by additional shipments from Ghana, huge increase from Cambodia, and increased shipments across a range of countries. Simply on what's happened so far, you would say that supply for Vietnamese processors is good, maybe even very good. But it is higher cost because it's from Cambodia. Or is it? Because when we look at the average prices of imports, compare 2022, 2023, 2024, January through to the 15th of July, we see that prices are slightly down. So what we're seeing is that the overall import price is about 4% lower. Now just bear in mind that the kernel's price is much higher, at least since May. But although the kernel's import price of RCN is lower, there's more high quality from Cambodia, less volume from West Africa, and what has come from West Africa in broad terms is lower quality. So it's not so simple as to say the average import price is lower. You have to factor in there's higher quality from Cambodia, lower quality from West Africa, and generally more from Cambodia and less from West Africa. Bearing in mind also that most of those contracts that are by now shipped and imported were done a long time ago, long before this market started to rise. So let's see if we can get some kind of a impression of the situation in Vietnam. And the big question really is there enough raw cashew nut stock available? Are there enough shipments? Is there enough product to manage until the balance from Côte d'Ivoire arrives? And bear in mind that when the balance from Côte d'Ivoire is shipped, it's going to be more than likely lower quality than it would have been had it been shipped 2 months ago. So I did a bit of a balance sheet. I'm still taking an opening stock unchanged, just under 300,000 tons. That includes work in progress, it includes kernels, it includes everything. I've taken a crop estimate of 315,000 tons, just simply the midpoint between the different estimates. Imports to the middle of July, 1.64 million tons, a record, 8.5% up, as we were saying. We shouldn't forget imports of unpeeled or so-called Burma kernels, which I've taken the kernels figure from Vinacas and converted it into raw cashew nuts for purpose of the balance sheet. And then the big number, and the big number is export. So record exports, we'll talk about that in a little while. But if you take exports and a little bit of domestic consumption, you're looking at about 1.8 million tons. Now, add all of that up, and you get a stock calculated. And this is a calculation, right? I haven't been around the warehouses and counted the bags. This is a calculation. So that would mean from mid-July, there's about 2.5 months of raw cashew nut stock. Is that enough? Tight, at best. So it does look to me as if the Vietnamese supply position for raw cashew nuts will tighten due to a lack of rivals from Côte d'Ivoire, but there is enough stock for the immediate needs. Question, who holds the stock? Is it in the hands of processors? Is it in the hands of importers, traders, speculators? Big question. When will those shipments from Côte d'Ivoire arrive? When will they take place? As I said, the suspension is still in place, 50 days after the first lifting. This is a key factor. If we take all of this, if we take this rate of exports, all of these factors, the balance of stock, it still suggests that Vietnam could buy another 1 million tons. Now that would mean that exports continue at the current rate, that processing continues at the current rate. And of course, those are questions. We'll look at those in a moment. But the basic calculation suggests that exports could hit close to the record 2.8 million tons. I'm not sure. Because I'm not sure that exports can continue at this rate, but that's where we stand today. What we are seeing is that if float material is trading at premium prices, that does suggest an expectation that inventories will tighten. And there is, of course, continues to be a temptation on the part of suppliers of low price contracts to delay or to default. In some cases, they have no choice, but in others, contracts have been defaulted and resold. And this needs to be addressed. This needs to be addressed yet again for the future of the sector. It's been going on for as long as I can remember. And in cashews, that's quite a long time now. I think one thing we should say here is that the more we look at the disruption caused by the export suspension in Côte d'Ivoire, the more and more disastrous it looks for the market in 2024. And it may well have impacts for Côte d'Ivoire too. But it doesn't seem to have yielded any particular benefits in the domestic processing industry, and it certainly has had a negative effect internationally on reputation, on market stability, and on an orderly marketing of cashew kernels, which long term is what's needed. Let's have a look at India. So India's imports are up to the end of May. Official figures only I have till the end of May. Strong start, emphasis on Tanzania in the early part of the year, and falling back now. So when you look at the gap between last year and this year, it's narrowing. These are cumulative figures, so these add up. And this is the total at the end of May, some 385,000 tons. And the gap between this year and last year is quite small. Where did it come from? So let's again look, and why are import figures in India up by 4%? Well, they're up by 4% mainly because of buying in Tanzania. All of the major West African origins are down. We can see Ivory Coast, we can see Burkina, Guinea, Nigeria, Ghana. Ironically, Benin, where exports are banned, has supplied more cashew nuts to India in 2024 than it did in 2023. That's pretty hard to believe. So the West African origins generally down due to a late crop, high prices, a little bit of a reluctance from processors to commit, a bit of a carry-in stock from last year. Look at some of the numbers and you can see Tanzania almost double, Ivory Coast down by some, 38,000 tons down. And you can see the impact in the different countries. So none of them are big numbers, except the increase imports from Tanzania, which is much more like the 2022 figure than the 2023 figure. And that's what's compensating. 4% up is not a big margin at the end of May, and we might see that just a little bit corrected in June, and then maybe a little bit of a spurt of growth again in July. Look at the average import prices again to the end of May. We're looking at much lower prices. So the difference between 2023 imports and 2024 in India is much bigger because prices generally have been lower. It's much bigger than it is in Vietnam because Vietnam has bought more high quality cashews from Cambodia, substituting what it might have bought from West Africa. So India's lower import cost is due to earlier imports, clever buying, picking the right origins. But it has, of course, at these lower prices meant that there's a huge incentive to profit take and to resell the raw cashew nuts. And many processors have decided to do that. Close the factory, reduce operations, resell the RCN, cash the profit, come back another day. And that's happening in a lot of factories, particularly those that are struggling in India, and can have a long-term effect on the industry too. If we look at the India situation, opening stock. So I've put in quite a high figure for opening stock. It's expressed in raw cashew nuts. That's mainly because of the kernel stock, not the RCN. Crop, we're saying in this case, 600,000 tons. Import so far, 385. Consumption, okay, so that's taking total Indian consumption and trying to distribute it between the first 5 months and the 12 months, coming in at about 650,000 tons for processing. Processing is probably down in India this year. That would give a balance of 785,000 tons, or about 4 months processing stock. based on what's happened so far this year. Maybe a little bit lower as the processing gears up for the big festivals in the latter part of the year. So the Indian situation is very fluid right now. There's more questions than answers, to be honest about it. High imports in 2023 had a knock-on effect into this year. India could still need, by my calculations, an additional 650,000 tonnes. Again, as with Vietnam, if demand holds up, if processing volumes hold up, you could be looking at 650,000 tonnes, which would mean about the same imports as last year, despite a lower crop. So again, it starts to look like 2022. Small and medium processors reducing processing, reselling their raw cashew nuts. That starts to change the sector a little bit. Interestingly, in India, something that's been, let's say, happening for some time, but we're really seeing it going now. The larger corporate buyers of kernels are on the rise. That means a different kind of contracting. It means maybe some forward contracting. It means a limitation to the number of grades used and increased snack usage. So the Indian consumer market in all products is developing rapidly and becoming more and more segmented, more and more stratified as a market. And this is just one sign of that. It's going to impact the cashew market in the future. That should mean, to suit this kind of demand, to suit this more sophisticated type of demand, that larger processing begins to emerge. And of course, that's in line with mechanization. You do need larger factories to be successful in a mechanized environment, but it will reduce the employment in the sector. And it does mean that in those larger factories, as we've seen elsewhere, including Vietnam, extremely so in West Africa, it needs greater financial capacity, greater access of individual companies to working capital, particularly if they're building a stock and selling it forward. When corporate buyers come into the market, another factor tends to emerge, and that is the need for credit terms. And of course, if people start looking for 30-day, 60-day payment, plus the cost of getting the product to the market, you start to look at increasing working capital needs. Interest rates then start to have a much greater bearing on the profitability of the industry. And I think that many of the processors in India who are talking about difficult times, I think they've got a point. That's reducing processing, and reduced processing is likely to keep raw cashew nut prices stable, but it could also lead to occasional peaks and troughs in the market, and I think we may have seen some of that already in India this year. So this reduced processing is a partial answer to the question as to why are Indian buyers not chasing raw cashew nut market when they have a lower crop in their own country. It's just quite a difficult environment. Now, that doesn't mean to say that Indian demand will not rise. I think it will. It doesn't mean to say that the Indian cashew sector won't continue to grow and be strong. I think it will. But it does mean to say that it's changing. And we may well see that play out over the next, this is not going to happen this week or next, this year or next, but over the next 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to see these structural changes. That will also affect the way that raw cashew nuts are bought in African countries. And that's a key impact. Just to point that out for African Cashew Alliance members who are joining us today. So that's the RCN trade. Let's have a look at cashew kernels. Let's have a look at demand and trade. And this is quite interesting. So we'd start with Vietnam. Again, the leading supplier, big shares in most markets. So they give us a good indication. Again, making the comparison, we can say, first of all, that exports from Vietnam are up by 25% in 2024. 2023 was a record. 2024 so far is a new record. And in the first half of July, compared to the first half of July of last year, exports up by 28%. It's remarkable. Any way you look at it, this is remarkable. So this is why, despite increased imports, there is a tightness in the supply of raw cashew nuts in Vietnam, simply because processors are exporting more and more every month, every year. And you can see it's consistent throughout the year, with the exception of February. Whereas February is when you see the impact of the Tet Festival. So you can discount it to a certain extent, but that was made up for by January, March, and so on throughout the year. If we look at where those cashew kernels are going, and I break it down into, the way I analyze it is I look at East Asia excluding China. So this will include markets like Japan, Korea, Philippines, Australia. We look at West Asia, which is primarily Middle East and North Africa, Europe, East and West, EU, UK, all European countries, North America, and China as a separate market because it's an interesting market to track. And if we look at the changes, you can see exports to all markets are up. So these are Vietnam's exports of cashew kernels between January and June. And these numbers are tons of kernels. And to look at the increases, East Asia plus 5%, West Asia plus 19%, Europe 19% up, the United States, Canada, Mexico up 24%, and China, it's hard to believe the number, but according to Vietnam Customs, figures which have been shown to be reliable in the past, exports to China are up by 62%. Vietnam is a reliable predictor of the overall market situation because Vietnam has 75% share of Europe, 88% of North America, 95% plus share of China, and significant shares, perhaps 70% in West Asia, and somewhere between 70 and 80% in East Asia. So these are reliable indicators of where the market is going. What are some of the factors involved? So here again is our increases, just to note the remarks. So impact. First of all, higher prices, and we've seen prices rise from $2.40, $3.20s to today, maybe $3.35, $3.20s. These prices can have an impact in markets in the Middle East and markets in China very quickly. Those are not markets which tend to buy forward. They are markets which tend to pass on price increases and decreases, so you get a much faster impact. If we look in Europe and North America, high increase in imports, but there are some indications that in expectation of disruption, longer transit, and emerging restrictions, that early in the year, Europeans and North Americans decided to take some of their shipments a little bit earlier, which processors would have been happy to do because A, prices were low, and B, they were receiving more and more raw material from Cambodia earlier than ever before. In Europe, we see this 19% up on shipments. Now, we're going to look at that in a minute because 19% on shipments does not match import figures to the end of May. So we need to have a little bit of a closer look at that. But the European economy is certainly improving. Germany might be lagging behind a little bit. Germany is a key market in Europe, a country of over 80 million people. Generally improving. The US economy is going from strength to strength at the moment. So those would be factors that would tend to indicate improved imports. I'm not sure about the number for Europe though. Meantime, defaults, delays, the impact of those in the past has been that initially, when you get a lot of contract defaults or renegotiations, initially you get an increase in demand as people come in to replace, renegotiate, buy some more, manage their risk. But as time goes on, it tends to kill off demand growth. So it's not just higher prices, it's the lack of reliability, the default of contract. Why would you buy something if you're not going to get it anyway? Why would you buy something from a supplier who's already owes you multiple containers? So initially defaults can increase demand, but then as time goes on, they can tend to kill off demand growth. Questions arising on these factors. How will buyers in these festival demand periods, especially in India and China, how will they react to higher prices? Very difficult to say. Will buyers in Europe and the US particularly, will they stop buying forward in the third quarter? So they were really happy to buy as far forward as they could get when markets were lower. Will they continue to do that now, or will they wait and see how the situation evolves in the course of the year? Let's have a closer look at one or two markets. We'll start looking at the US market. So again, US imports, I just tracked 6 years for the purpose of this. And I tracked 6 years because you got to go back a few years to get out of the COVID impact. And therefore we need to kind of leave out 2020, 2021 in order to get a real idea of the trend. But what we do see is month on month, particularly February, March, May, big increases in imports compared to last year. Overall, 5 months imports into the US are up 21%. That is significant, and it does match the pattern of shipments from Vietnam. The pattern also suggests, just the way the containers have arrived, that there may have been some people taking earlier shipments. Now, that could be a factor. I'm not saying it's absolutely a factor in the US, but I think there is an element of that there, which would suggest that inventory levels would be quite healthy rather than a big spike in demand, which would in turn take a little bit of the heat or the impact out of the situation later in the year. All of these imports are at low contracted prices. So that would mean that most imports to the US at low prices, whatever inventory is there, it remains competitive in the market price-wise. All of this looks positive, but comes with a little bit of a health warning. 2022, first 5 months, looked pretty similar, looked very positive. But in the second half of the year, demand crashed. Now, at that time, demand crashed because of economic conditions. If you remember, 2022 was the year that Russia invaded Ukraine, major economic impact of that, a lot of uncertainty, imports fell away. The economy now looks much stronger, you would have to say that. But just keep an eye. We need to be careful of that. The US is important. North America generally is about 18% of world demand. The US is 90% of that. What the impact will be of these higher kernels prices, and of course of the defaults and delays in shipments in the US market, will be critical in deciding future demand. And we're not really now thinking about 2024. We're now starting to think about 2025, because buyers in North America, buyers in Europe will start during August into September. If they haven't already done it, they're starting to look at 2025. Are they seeing encouraging signs? What do higher prices mean? One thing we can say, we can look at the shares. So we are seeing slightly encouraging signs, again, for African cashew processing. First 5 months of this year, Vietnam's share remains rock steady, around about 89%, 88 to 89%, 88.4, I think it is. Brazil's share is down now, less than 2%. That was unthinkable 20 years ago. Interesting news. African share in 2023 was 6.5%. In the first 5 months of 2024, 8.5%. That's an increase of 30%. Very positive news. We haven't seen growth in African processors' share of the US market for some time, but we are seeing it in the first 5 months of this year. Let's hope it continues. Let's have a look at Europe. So here you have in the bars the cumulative, adding up month by month, imports of cashew kernels into the European Union plus the UK. And those are compared to the lines, the same numbers for 2020, 2022, and 2023. I've left 2021 out deliberately. So what we see here is that really positive trend, slow start in January, and since then it's picked up. Imports for the 5 months for the whole region up by 6.6%. Again, we're looking at low contracted prices, any inventory that remains. And by the way, I don't think there is much inventory lying in Europe unsold. But if it's there, it's low priced inventory. Similar to North America, 2022 actually looked better than this, more than 6% up, and then demand crashed. I'm not saying it will, not by any means, but what I am saying is it can happen. So we do need to keep an eye on this. Question is, what will the impact of higher prices be? What will the impact of defaults be on the one side? And then on the other side, what will the impact be of an improving economy in Europe? Some very positive numbers were released yesterday on European economic growth for 2024. What will the impact have been in consumption of cashews by the Euros, football championships, and of course by the Olympic Games, both of which may well boost consumption of snacks in Europe. We should also look, as we did earlier, we should look again at the monthly change in imports, because what I'm looking for here is there any evidence that rather than taking more cashews, they just took them earlier in a response to some of the disruption or potential disruption to shipments due to the conflict in the Gulf, general delays, the problems with the Suez Canal. And it does look as if there may well be. So we see a big spike in the month of March. So a big growth in imports in the month of March. So that would have been decisions that might have been made in January or early February in terms of shipments. So if someone said, look, ship my March and April contracts as soon as possible, we'll take them in, we'll pay for them, that would impact in March. So you see big growth February, March, and then very little and even a decline in May. So overall 6.6% up, but the trend is waning a little bit in Europe. And this may be due to the impact of a decision to accelerate shipments. And that pattern, to me, does suggest that there were some earlier shipments taken. So the actual underlying demand may not be as positive as the initial 5-month statistics would suggest. What is positive is the change in African imports into Europe. So we look at market share. I'm just reflecting back 2020, for the full year, African processors had a 7% share of the European market. In 2023, that had expanded to 17.1%. And for the first 5 months of 2024, it's just under 22%. So that is pretty remarkable. Compared to 8.5% share of the US market, this is fantastic progress for African cashew processing and real indications that the development of processing in Africa is here to stay, and that European buyers at least are supporting that. Where does it come from? Well, dominated by Côte d'Ivoire. 61% of imports of African cashew kernels into Europe in the first 5 months of 2024 were from Côte d'Ivoire. There were also increases from Tanzania, there were increases from Nigeria, Ghana, and from Benin. But as you can see from the table, these countries, although increasing, are relatively small providers compared to Côte d'Ivoire. All positive news in that sense, and I think that we are at last seeing something of a breakthrough for African exports of cashew kernels to the European market. It has an impact on processing in Africa, so I thought we'd have a quick look at this. So this is, you will have seen this before. This is our 2023 processing capacity in various countries in West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and Burkina Faso. They've added processing capacity either in existing or in new factories over the last 6 months or so. 15,000 tons added in Ghana, 20 in Nigeria, possibly more. That will scale up over time. 45,000 in Cote d'Ivoire. Again, it'll take time to scale up. 40,000 in Benin. In 2024, new factories opened in 6 African countries. We're talking about substantial factories. We're talking about mechanized, large-scale factories. Unfortunately, in many of these same countries, factories also closed, either temporarily or, sadly, in some cases, permanently. And it's right across the region as well. So Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Benin, factories where some of them closed temporarily. Of course, almost every factory that closes initially closes temporarily, and it's only over time that that becomes permanent. But there's a worrying trend. There is expansion, but there's also factories closing or suspending their operations at the same time. Generally speaking, broad picture is positive progress on processing in Africa. Let's have a look at prices. More to record the prices than to comment on where they might go. So what we've seen so far this year is a little bit of a roller coaster. We've seen prices up, not a lot of business was done, very high levels, crashed back down, and they've settled for the time being. There is a little bit of buying going on at the moment, but it doesn't seem to be moving prices. Some of the cheaper offers are getting taken out, but generally speaking, the market looks quite steady. It means that most, and these are critical things looking forward, most forward sales are still below today's market. Most inventory is below today's market. This means that market prices are likely to be quite sensitive in the coming months. They may go up, they may go down, but they are quite likely to move. Prices are not high historically. Yes, we have seen a big increase from these very low levels over a long period, but we are only 14% above the 5-year average. And we're 8% below the 5-year high. And these 5 years have not been a period of high prices. So it's kind of interesting. And just to put it in perspective, today on the 31st of July, 2024, we are at exactly the same price for 320s as we were on the 1st of August, 2014, 10 years ago. Given everything that's happened, given the costs, given the huge price bubble, that says a lot. And it does actually go to show just how difficult this business can be at times. So looking at prices throughout the year, and looking at RCN prices, RCN has been volatile this year. Prices started at last year's levels, and then they dipped on forecasts of a good crop, and then we saw it's just gone up and up. But we should bear in mind that effectively prices have moved up and they've come back, but they are actually a little bit higher for comparison purposes because generally speaking this year quality is lower. So same price for lower quality is effectively a price rise. What is happening is that a premium is emerging for a float material, in other words material that's close to hand. That unfortunately encourages contract default, but it is a fact and it is an indicator. And what we're also seeing is that the premiums for higher quality are widening. So the gap between a £49, if you can find one, and a £46 is getting bigger because there's less and less good quality material available. As it stands, the current raw cashew nut prices, they do work for efficient processors versus today's kernels market. Now, efficient means you got your costs under control, you're managing your factory well and all those factors. But they certainly do not work against past sales. And as we've said, all forward sales are below today's market. So you've got this problem. You buy RCN to execute an old sale, you're going to lose money. You buy it today to make a new sale, you could make a profit. Processors continue to struggle. They struggle with higher costs, and we see that in India. We see increasing wages, we see increasing costs of logistics, we see higher freight costs, and most of all, we see this problem for processors of executing forward sales when they're not receiving the raw cashew nuts that either they expected or that they contracted for. So this is reducing in a delay in shipments of kernels. It's reducing processing, and it's therefore could, in the second half of the year, and certainly in 2025, could have an impact on demand. So whilst we look at kernels prices, they are sustainable from a demand perspective. People will still continue to buy cashews at these prices. But RCN prices are not sustainable based on what's already happened and the current prices. So on the contracts that are already made and the current prices. So what is happening is that processors who sell and then buy their raw cashew nuts later are in a difficult position, which accounts for a lot of processors. So you have a system that demands that processors sell forward in order to get business. They need business because they need contracts, because they need finance. Then they're into that situation when the market goes up. They either have to renegotiate, they have to make some new sales to try and average, and in some cases, they may well go out of business. In others, in markets where they don't sell forward, they tend to reduce the processing capacity. And we're seeing a little bit of that in India. So it wouldn't be at all surprising that 2024 results in an increase in the speed of rationalization in the cashew processing sector. Final segment, policy and regulation. Let's have a look at some of the things that have happened in the first part of 2024. Major changes. Cambodia introduced a policy to improve the quality of its raw cashew nuts and to improve value addition in the cashew sector. That policy was signed into law at the end of January, and it's currently under implementation. In Benin, we saw the ban on exports continue through the year. In Ghana, we've seen significant regulatory development with the Tree Crops Development Authority. We've seen registration of stakeholders, control of who can buy at the farm gate, and possibly a window for processors to source their products. In Côte d'Ivoire, we've talked much about the export ban mid-season. In Guinea-Bissau, we've seen significant action to encourage and enforce legal export compared to previous years where the product was moved across the border into Senegal, into the Gambia. These are just 5 examples. There are others, but certainly governments have taken a much greater interest in the cashew sector in recent years. They have been successful in some cases and not in others, but we are looking at the prospect of further government intervention. Let's have a look in a little bit more detail and some of the impacts of government policy. We'll start in Benin, where exports were banned and that ban was maintained throughout the season. That has caused a huge spike in illegal cross-border trade, export by land into Togo, Nigeria, and so on. Processing has increased, make no mistake, but sourcing of raw nuts by the organization responsible for the GDIZ processors or by individual processors for their own use has not really been as successful as it might have been. They tell me that only 45,000 tons has been procured, way below capacity, and a disappointing result for the year. So processors are struggling. Now this leaves a situation where coming into 2025, we will not have a minimum farm gate price under current regulation. We will have an export ban under current regulation. This leaves farmers in Benin very vulnerable to lower farm gate prices. And we're not talking about wealthy people here. We're talking about some of the smallest, some of the poorest farmers on the planet. And they will be vulnerable in 2025 unless this system is somehow retuned. In Côte d'Ivoire, we saw the export suspension, and its impact has been a lower quality of raw cashew nuts because the infrastructure isn't there to hold the raw cashew nuts whilst the ban is in place. An increase in the cross-border trade, mainly into Ghana. And probably the biggest impact is a negative impact on the reputation of the country, a negative impact on the reputation of the cashew sector in Côte d'Ivoire as a destination. So today, in Côte d'Ivoire, they're having a close look at how their sector was managed in recent years. They're having a close look at how the sector can be managed in the future. And there's no doubt that this kind of policy volatility is definitely going to damage reputation, because people are going to wonder, well, if they change one thing, will they change another thing? Looking forward into 2025, and given what's happened this year, would you buy forward from Côte d'Ivoire? Would you buy forward on the basis that your contract may be delayed by 2 months or 3 months? Would you pay 10% in advance for something that you don't know when it's going to get shipped? It's a big question, and I think that forward contracting, or the risk of forward contracting not taking place, is a major risk for the country for the 2025 crop. And of course, it has an impact because a lot of the working capital, a lot of the finance, a lot of the money advanced into the sector is dependent on forward contracting of raw cashew nuts. Again, I suspect that this export suspension, which has gone on much longer than was expected, and I do understand that the CCA would like to remove it, but I think they're still waiting for general agreement on that, and 50 days have passed since the lifting of the first stage. I think it could cast a long shadow over the sector. More positively, in Guinea-Bissau, changes to the system have allowed better access at the farm gate, reduction in taxation, or at least a restructuring of taxation. This has reduced the illegal trade cross-border. It's not illegal from Senegal point of view, it is illegal from Guinea-Bissau point of view. That the percentages that will be exported through the port of Bissau will be much higher this year than last year. There will be an improved tax revenue as a result, and of course that will, you would expect, build some confidence in the sector in Guinea-Bissau. Quite positive changes. It is a volatile market, it is a volatile economy. Let's hope that those positive moves continue. In Ghana, the new regulatory framework with registration of actors, I think, has contributed to lower volatility of prices at the farm gate. Prices did move up and down, but the margin was less. The time of volatility was less this year. It does seem to have worked to a certain extent. Processors are now engaged, and I think we may be looking at a new era in the Ghanaian cashew sector if this regulatory approach can be properly implemented, and signs so far are really good. So we've looked across a whole range of things. We've looked at production, we've looked at demand and processing, we've looked at the raw cashew nut trade, prices, policy and regulation in 2024. And what we've seen is a really volatile year. Volatility is not great for business. So the second half of this year is going to be critical. What are some of the key points that we need to look at? So on production, yes, production is lower, but it's not unmanageably lower in terms of the overall supply and demand. The final outturn of Indian production is now a key factor. This is certainly something, if those estimates are right, of 20% or more less of a crop, it is going to have an impact, and that'll be the impact that determines the second half of the year. In terms of demand and processing, cashew kernels price levels are sustainable at the current levels. Significant RCN buying is still to be done, but I don't see it sustaining higher prices for now. The disruption to the market certainly could undermine demand growth this year, and this is something we need to look at. We've had quite a difficult first half of the year. Generally, volatility, difficult times discourages buyers from further demand growth. I think we're going to see further processor rationalization in India, in Vietnam, and in Cote d'Ivoire. I think we will see some smaller, less well-established, less competitive factories closing, going out of business, being absorbed by larger units. And I think that process will take some years. Processing overall will probably continue to grow, but it will grow in a different way than it has done in the past. Some of the impacts then of what we've seen over the first half of the year, I think that this regulatory conundrum in Cote d'Ivoire may cast a long shadow over both the Ivorian cashew sector and cause some reputational damage to the West African cashew sector generally. I think the defaults and delays on raw cashew nuts and kernels are certainly, and I mean this in the broadest sense, not just about Africa or Cote d'Ivoire, but generally undermining the reputation of the cashew sector. You know, if you're an American buyer and you can get a truckload of almonds from California in a couple of weeks, reliably, at a fixed price, or buy a truckload of cashews from 10,000 miles away or 3,000 miles away and maybe get it or maybe not, or maybe get it later or maybe not get it later, or maybe the quality is good or maybe it's not, that has definitely got an impact on your decision. So that is a key factor. It's happened in the past, it's happening now. We need to address this. But to finish on a positive note, I think that from an African processor's point of view, 2024 has been an opportunity. It is an opportunity. We see that in increases in market shares, up to 8.5% share of the US market, January to May 2024, up to 22% share of the EU market, really positive numbers, and that it's a real opportunity for African processors. What a year. What an interesting time to be in the cashew business. I hope you've enjoyed our perspective. I look forward to your questions. Let me hand you back to Ernest. See if we've got some questions or comments.
Thank you so much.
Ernest.
Thank you so much, Jim. I'll tell you that all this is possible. Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Very good. So thank you so much for the presentation. And there are a lot of questions here. But let me first of all remind you that all this is possible with the support of the EU, the OACPS, GIZ move, sustainable nuts initiatives possible. Let me also say, initially we were expecting Mr. Lee from Jihad Nut, but we'll see whether he's online, and then we'll link him directly to Jim for it to continue. But now with the Q&A. The first question is more about the overall crop estimates for West Africa and how it compares with 2023. I know that you've talked about the fact that there is, in terms of the overall estimate, 10% down from last year. And in terms of kernel, even 13% down. But what are the actual figures?
I'm sorry, Ernest, I lost you there for a moment.
in 2023 and 2024. This, or rather, just for production compared to last year up to June or July, because we've talked about 10% down, and then you've also talked about even in kernel terms, it is 13% down. Did you hear this?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Okay, so the figure comes in at exactly 10% down. I'm just looking at my database here.
What is the actual figure compared to that of last year? That is what the customer wants to know, yes.
Well, by my estimates, this year is 2.247 and last year was 2.536 million. That figure is an RCN figure, so yeah.
The follow-up question is, why is this not translated into high RCN prices?
But it is. I mean,
did you get that, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, it is
Hello,
translated. It is translated into RCN prices. Let's have a look at our.
Yes.
Let's see if we can get
the question now. Because actually, what you presented at some point was that prices are slightly down in 2024.
No.
So might be the question. So maybe you can clarify that a bit. How this 10% drop in RCN volumes, which is also translating in 13% in terms of kernel, how is it impacting?
Okay, so let's just go one question at a time. So first of all, look at the chart. I don't think that says that RCN prices are down. It pretty clearly shows RCN prices are up. What I said was they went up and then they came down a little bit later. They're off the highs. That's the first thing. The second factor is, okay, so let's say if you said that West African raw cashew nuts were an average outturn of, let's say, 48 pounds. And let's say this year we said the average outturn, because we got to weigh it heavily in favor of the major volume origins, Cote d'Ivoire and so on. So let's say the average was 48. That means that you lose about 9% of the crop. So that means that the outturn yield is affected by 9%, and that's the way you do it. So if we took all of the origins, we would have to factor in the yield factor for each one. So Ghana might have been normally 50 pounds. We might be taking 49 this year. Cote d'Ivoire, we might normally take 47, and this year we might take 45, and that has an impact. And that's how you say that the kernels will be less. But in order to be precise on that, we would have to go in country by country, and maybe we'll do that one of these days. But for now, we're estimating that will add an additional reduction in available kernels of about 2.5 to 3%.
Then the next question is on Vietnam, and that if the RCN stock availability is low or tightened, you talked about 2.5 months stock. What should we expect in Tanzania? Is there going to be a rush of Vietnamese buyers?
No, I see. This is the point, right? So it's very easy to make the conclusion.
Tanzania in the upcoming.
Ernest, I'm not sure if it's your end or my end, but I'm losing the end of each question. So I think you're asking me about Tanzania. And
yes, no, Tanzania, and whether we will have a lot of Vietnamese buyers rushing to.
I don't think so, because in actual fact, the Tanzanian raw material would arrive too late. So Tanzanian raw material can be a bridge between 2024 crop and 2025 crop, but there's a couple of points. First of all, Tanzanian raw material, generally speaking, is higher priced than other origins because of its quality. Secondly, the Indian buyers tend to favor Tanzanian raw material But I do not think that people will rush into the auction in Tanzania early, simply because they look at it and they'll say, well, let's see how our demand is. Let's see how these higher prices have impacted. So even if you enter the auction, let's say on the 20th of October, you won't see that product in your factory until probably January processing. So that means that there is unlikely to be a rush into Tanzania for reasons of 2024 crop reduction. By then, the problem will either be resolved or not. So I don't expect a big rush into Tanzania.
There are a couple of questions on India, but before we go there, the question here on quality is, what is the quality of RCN nuts in Cambodia? And again, for West Africa, is it the case that this whole low quality is due only to climate change? And what are the measures being put in place to address that?
The quality of cashews from Cambodia is generally high outturn, very large nuts. So you are looking, the most interesting characteristic about Cambodian raw cashew nuts is the size. So you're looking at counts 160 is common, 140 is regular. So you're looking at very large nuts. They are relatively high outturn, 50, 51, even higher in some cases. There may be some question marks about the peeling characteristics of Cambodian nuts. The M23 variety, which is the driver of this surge in production, accounts for about 60% of the plantings in Cambodia. There may be some questions about its peeling characteristics. And that means that sometimes the Cambodian nuts tend to head for the markets which take the unpeeled kernels. But generally speaking, high quality. In terms of the second part of the question, there's no doubt that the quality of raw cashew nuts this year has suffered as a result of the weather and climatic conditions during the growing season. And there's no doubt that those conditions were impacted by climate change, and therefore it looks like these problems are here to stay. What we can do about them, and most countries have identified these factors, but they're struggling to implement the improvements. So, for example, better post-harvest handling, earlier, better drying, better storage, better education of farmers, research into varieties which are more drought resistant. As someone said at one of those African Cashew Alliance conferences in recent years, forgive me whoever said it, I can't remember who it was right now, but cashew trees are resilient and drought resistant, but the yields that they give are not. And therefore we will see decreasing yields if we don't do something about it. So what should be done is pretty well identified in terms of improved varieties, better management, and some of those interventions are quite simple. Similarly with the post-harvest interventions, but in many cases they haven't been widely implemented across the sector. So the answer to the problem has been to plant more trees, but there's a limit to the number of trees you can plant. There's a limit to the number of trees that you take out to plant new trees. And therefore we need to look at not more trees, but better practices on farms. And I think in many cases that's well identified. It's a question of implementation now.
Thank you very much, Jim. Now let me move on to India, the questions on India, before I get to policy. And there is information that 3 major producing centers in India are currently on strike for all of August to reduce supply and control declining prices of kernels. So what do you think the impact of this could be on raw cashew and kernel market in India? Did you get the question well?
Yes, it did.
And sorry, our listeners, for the poor internet access that I think I'm having at my end. And once Jim can get a question, then he should answer them properly for us. Thank you very much, Jim.
Sorry, Ernest, can you give me that question again, please?
So what I'm saying is that the information that we have in the Q&A is that 3 major producing centers in India are currently on strike for all of August to reduce supply and control declining prices of kernels. And what do you think the impact of this will be on the raw cashew nut and kernel markets of India?
I referred to that throughout the presentation, and I said that processing capacity in India would be reduced.
Could you in the next for the next question also, it's saying that in India, the stock calculation slide, what is your estimated cashew kernel quantity for local consumption per month? Are you tracking local consumption per month also?
No.
Of course, India is purely fully locally consumed. So you may have some estimation there, but the question is, are you tracking local consumption in India per month?
Yes, I'm tracking local consumption in India.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we are losing a bit of the text because of the internet, but you have given the estimates for January to July for India in terms of RCN arrival. And the Sakar here wants to know, what is the estimated arrival for India from July to December? Do you have any estimated arrivals for RCN? What are you estimating?
I'll take it as a compliment that people are asking me to predict the future. What I said is that there is a potential for India to buy an additional 650,000 tons of raw cashew nuts by my calculations. So in addition to the 385, so there's 385 to the end of May, plus whatever was imported in June. So let's say 130. And let's say the top estimate is 650, which would give us an import for 2024 of 1.17 million tons.
Okay. So Jim, the next question also is on policy, but maybe before we go to policy, the question here I have is that you have presented Vietnam and India import consumption and balance details from January to which month? I think to July. That's what you did?
June.
June, okay. So Bhupendra, it's from January to June. That's a question. But we had Mr. Bade from Senegal who was asking what ACA and CICC are doing to address the export bans in Cote d'Ivoire and Benin, and so that the informal cross-border trades can be reduced. I think for us in this CICC and ACA, we have worked together as partners and addressed a lot of these issues and also engaged government. But a key issue is also to look at the policy intentions. The policy intentions behind some of these cross-border bans and the ban on export has been 2. 1, to promote domestic processing, and secondly, to also manage and retain some kind of domestic income by way of taxes. But I think for us, the big issue has to do more with the predictability of these policies. So this is where, if you take the case of Benin, it was already announced in 2022 that there will be a ban. But Cote d'Ivoire, as Jim rightly puts it, it's been more ad hoc. And I think this is something that we will have to engage more with the CCA to make sure that next year it's more predictable. People should know what they are confronted with before even the start of the year in terms of policies, and especially with the ban. And then hopefully we can address some of the reputational damages that are likely to occur. So I think this is what explanation I will give here to Barbie from Senegal, and also to thank him for his participation in the forum. Jim, did I come out clearly?
We could hear you very well, Ernest.
Okay, very good. So now the other question is still back now to Vietnam, and they are wondering whether Vietnam really could have 2.5 months stock, given the late crop and the huge IBC shipment yet to arrive. So here, I mean, it's more doubting the figure, whether indeed there is even anything like 2.5 months stock in Vietnam.
Yeah, but you gotta be realistic here. Now, a lot of people are trying to boost the price of RCN, right? And I can hear a lot of the questions are phrased to do that. And I'm not interested in speculators, and I'm not interested in speculative type questions, right? That's really important. So if you think you can increase the value of your RCN on this webinar, forget about it, number one. Number two, there's no impact of the ban in Ivory Coast in Vietnam yet. None. The ban came in on the 11th of May. Our figures are up to the 15th of June. Anything that arrived was already shipped. And if you look at the presentation, you'll see, let me bring you back to it. So here's the imports. In 2023, the volumes of imports came in July and August. The import volume in the first half, in June of 2024 was the same in Vietnam as it was in June of 2023. So as at the end of June, there was no impact of the ban. The ban, which was implemented early in May, can only affect arrivals from July onwards. So the figures we've presented are up to the 15th of July. And therefore, it's highly likely. I would say 2.5 months might even be on the low side. It is quite possible if you just add up your numbers. If you think of the basics, what was your opening stock? What was your crop? What were your imports? These are known figures. No dispute on these figures. These are not estimates, these are statistics. Imports of Burma kernels, statistics. Exports, statistics. Domestic is not a statistic, it's an estimate, but it's a tiny proportion of the number, less than 5%. So if you add up the numbers, that's what you get.
Okay.
Now, how could that vary? Well, if Vietnamese customs didn't know their figures and they got their imports wrong or their exports wrong, it could be different. If the opening stock, which could be the case, if the opening stock was higher, then it'd be more than 2.5 months. So we're not talking here about, I'm not saying this figure is absolutely correct, but we're not talking about guesswork. We're talking about just using the available numbers to calculate what the situation is. Now, if there was more opening stock, then it's more than 2.5 months. So you can't say, and this is a big problem in our industry. People say, oh, the shipments were late, it was a late year, it must be a worse situation. But all they're doing is talking their book. So, and this is a situation which is continually arising in our industry. People prefer to talk their own book and their own interest than to actually identify the real numbers and the reality. And that is really bad for business. I can't tell you how bad that is for business. You can imagine an investor looking at an industry that doesn't have numbers. They'd go somewhere that does have numbers, wouldn't they? So when we talk about the 2.5 months, we're talking about a calculation based on figures. If you don't agree with the figures, that's a different matter. If you don't agree with the imports or the crop, if you don't agree with the exports, that they're all a discussion. But based on the numbers, that's what you get. So to say it couldn't be, it says more about an individual's way of thinking than it does about the reality. So yes, it could be wrong, But which number is wrong? That's what we should be discussing. Not, it couldn't be that. Because, well, gee, it doesn't suit me that it's that. Anyway, 2.5 months is nothing. This is the other point. See, if you think like a trader, you go 2.5 months, I'm not going to get an order for 2.5 months. That's not good news. I won't be able to get the price up. But if you think like an industrialist, you go 2.5 months inventory is not a lot of inventory. Not when I've got to transform that and ship it and get paid for it before I return that cash into my system. So
Thank you very much, Jim. The last question, Jim. Hi,
Yeah.
Jim.
Yeah.
Last question. It's from Sri Rama, who is saying that 2.56 million tons West African crop estimate for 2023 season looks underestimated, and that actual landings in India and Vietnam are much higher, and it indicates more than 3 million ton crop from West Africa in, now he says 2023 season. So it's not so clear though. But he's saying 2.56 million ton is underestimated.
So the total landing into the two countries in the year was 3.9 million tons. That included stock that was held in transit, stock that was afloat, shipped from the 2022 crop. 3.9 million tons includes Cambodia, East Africa, Indonesia. Includes all transit stock, of which there was about 300,000 tons. So you do need to dig into the numbers a little bit to try to understand them. If you want to do that, come on with us, come on to the seminar one day and we'll discuss it. Again, this thing of throwing out numbers, INC says this, INC says that, come on. Let's get professional about the way we talk about the cashew industry. Thank you, Ernest.
Yeah, and see you all in Cotonou, and let's talk more about the industry. But before that, Jim, the next GME is on 28th of this month. What do you have for us, or what should we be expecting between now and then, and what do you have for us on 28th?
Well, I'm just going to suggest to you that you have a look at some of the questions that are arising. Look at key things. How much is India's crop down by? Now, I'm saying down by because I think it's almost certain it's lower than last year, but how much is it lower? Big question. How will buyers, especially in India and in China, respond to these higher prices that we're seeing? Will we see good buying, particularly, and it should happen around about now, from China for the autumn festival at these higher prices? It'll be interesting to see what's happening on the Côte d'Ivoire export ban. Why has it not been lifted? When will it be lifted? When will the remaining stock get shipped for export? Big question, but over a longer period of time, how big is the crisis in processing in RCN importing countries? We hear a lot from India. We hear a lot from Vietnam of the difficulties. How big is that problem? It's not the first time. I've talked about a rationalization. I expect to see that happen. How big is the crisis? That'll determine how quickly the rationalization happens. And then finally, we'll move on. By the end of the month, we'll be looking at East Africa and how are the East African crops looking. So we might start the next session by having a look at Southern Hemisphere cashew producing countries. We'll have a look at their likely production, structures of the markets, and we might even be lucky enough to get one or two guests on from perhaps Mozambique and Tanzania to chat to us about the prospects for the 2024 crop. Thank you everyone for joining us as always. This was the 70th, can you believe that? This was the 70th GME. The picture you see on the screen is of traders in Germany negotiating and testing the quality of commodities almost 500 years ago. So this has been going on for a long time. I don't think there was any cashews there. Thanks everyone. See you next time. Take care of yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jim. Thanks to all participants. Let's see you again on the 28th of this month. Bye-bye till then.